Merry Christmas! Today's book that I'm reading from is called The Happy Christmas Storybook. This is a very old book. It was read to me when I was a little girl. And since my mom read it to me when I was a little girl, I'm going to read it to you. You can see it's not in great condition, so I am going to be careful as I read it, but I thought you might enjoy the story the way I did when I was a little girl. All right, the very first story is the one I'm reading, and the title is How the Forest Fairies Met Santa Claus. And here is the picture on that very first page. Okay. Once upon a time, a long, long time ago, there was a very special big tree in a big forest. It was so big and so tall that you could hardly see to the top of it, and its branches reached almost to the sky. It had lived many, many years, and now was a very old tree. Whenever a strong wind began to blow, the great old tree would shiver and shake, and its branches would moan and groan in the wind. It was getting old and tired. With each new storm, the old tree shook more and more, and then one night there was a very, very bad storm. The wind blew, and the rains beat down upon that old tree until it could stand no longer, and finally it tumbled to the ground with a loud crash. It was such a mighty old tree that when the forest woodcutters saw it lying on the ground the next day, they said it was too big to cut and move away. And so there it lay, one end resting on the ground and the other on a big, big rock. There it stayed for years and years and years, just as it had fallen so long ago. Wild vines grew over it, and bushes and ferns grew around it and in it. In the springtime, tiny baby birds made their first nest in the vines that grew in the old tree trunk. In the summertime, pretty forest flowers grew among the ferns and bushes around the tree. In autumn, the wind blew many-colored leaves under the tree, and in wintertime, the pure white snow made the old tree look beautiful. And then, one springtime, 3 little forest fairies found the old fallen tree, and they loved it. They cleared away the dead autumn leaves and the broken branches, and they made it into their home. But no one ever knew there was something very special and magical under that tree, except, of course, all of the little friendly fairy folk. Here's our picture. These little forest fairies were very little and very cute. They were called Thinker and Tinker and Winker. Thinker was a serious little forest fairy. Tinker was forever getting into mischief, and Winker was a happy little forest fairy who never acted grown up at all. They had long white beards that they tucked into the collars of their jackets when they were very cold, and they had little round faces that would make you smile just to see them. They were very busy little forest fairies, for they had many jobs to do every day. Thinker watched over the forest trees and bushes. Tinker watched over the tiny forest animals, and Winker watched over the forest flowers. The smoke from their little fire curled up over the tree trunk and floated into the forest. They were preparing their dinner, laughing and talking, when they heard a noise that made them stop and listen. It was a strange noise, a new noise, a sound they had never heard before, and they lived in the forest for hundreds of years. For fairies live forever, as you know. And yet they had never heard such a sound. "What can it be?" Thinker asked excitedly. "I don't know," said Winker with big poppy eyes. "It wasn't in the house," said Tinker. "It was outside, somewhere in the forest." As the noise became louder and nearer, the 3 little forest fairies looked at each other in alarm. They didn't know what this was. They put their little shoes on with their turned-up toes, and they ran about in a circle, stamping out their fire so no one would discover their home beneath the fallen tree. When the fire was out, they slipped on their tight little jackets with bright shiny buttons and put on the crinkly stovepipe hats and quietly climbed out of their secret hidden house and into the trunk of the tree and ran along to where they could see far into the forest without being seen themselves. For they were tiny little forest fairies, you know, and never went far from their home under the old tree. There's the forest in the winter. But by the time they had dressed themselves and were outside, there was no one in sight, and they heard nothing. They were too late. Whatever had made that strange noise was gone. I wonder what it was, said Winker. So do I, said Thinker. It frightened me. We have never heard a noise quite like that before, said Tinker. It didn't sound like any of our animal friends, and it didn't sound like a noise from the trees or the bushes, said Winker, and it frightens me too. Maybe whatever made that noise is still here, hiding behind one of the trees. And because this big forest was known all over the world for its fir trees, the other two fairies thought about it for a few minutes, and Thinker whispered very softly, Maybe you are right. Let's go back home now, where we will be safe and warm, and wait and see if we hear any more strange noises. But everything was quiet for the rest of the day, and the fairies went about their work as usual. And that night, as the little forest fairies were getting ready for bed, they wondered again what the noise had been, for they had lived in that same forest for years and years and years, and the only noises they knew were the sounds of the hunter and the sounds of the woodcutter, and the noise they had heard at dinner time was different from all of these. The next morning, when they awakened, they sat up in their beds and listened to see if they would hear that strange noise again, but the only sounds they heard were the chirping of the birds, the north wind rustling the branches and trees, and the crunching sound of little forest animals as they walked through the woods. The three little forest fairies ate an especially big breakfast, for they had such a big job to do. They had been collecting enough twigs and sticks for firewood to last all winter long, and their little arms could only carry a few twigs and a few branches at a time, so they had to make many, many trips into the forest. They were very careful to listen for strange sounds and to look for strange signs as they collected their firewood, but they saw nothing at all, except some new prints on the ground, which they were sure must belong to a woodcutter or a hunter, for they had seen such marks before. Late that afternoon, as they were preparing their dinner and laughing and talking together, they heard that same strange noise, just as they had heard the night before. They stopped talking and listened. It's the same noise, whispered Thinker. I think you're right, said Tinker. But what could it be? Asked Winker. We never heard such a strange noise before. Do you think maybe it is a human voice? Well, let's go see what it is, said Tinker and Thinker. Hurry! This time the three little forest fairies were quick to put on their little shoes and with the turned-up toes, and their little tight jackets with the shiny buttons, and their crinkly stovepipe hats, for they were excited to see the strange new sound and see where it came from. And they didn't want to miss it because they were too slow, and as they had been the first time they heard the noise. Yesterday, they really had been afraid of that strange noise, but today the sound was closer, and they could tell it was a good sound. And they didn't want to miss it. It was a happy sound. Maybe it really was a human voice, but what would a human look like? They had never seen human beings, but they had talked with the little echo fairies who lived in the bottom of wells, and they had told them about human voices and how some sounded happy, and then the humans had a happy face. Some sounded sad, and then the humans had a sad face. Well, they had never seen the hunters and the woodcutters, but they had heard the noises so many times and knew them well. And this noise that they had heard was not one that they knew. It was strange and different. Quickly, they climbed up on the tree trunk and they ran along it until they could see far into the forest. Thinker looked one way in the thick forest, and Winker looked another way, but they saw nothing and they heard nothing. Where could the noise have gone? Asked Thinker. It was just here, said Winker. And their faces were disappointed, for they were hoping to see where this strange new sound came from and what made it. They were about to turn around and climb back along the tree trunk to their house when Tinker shouted, "Look, look, over there, see?" A little hand pointed toward a fir tree. I see, it's bright red. Could it really be a human being? But is bright red what a human being looks like?" Just then the wind blew and a branch from the fir tree moved, and all three forest fairies saw more than just something bright red. They saw something white and more red, and there was black too. It was a pair of shiny black boots. You getting some guesses? "Why, look, it has a face almost like ours," said Winker. "Surely it must be human," said Tinker. And just as the little fairy said this, a human laughed. A long, deep, happy laugh that made him shake all over like a bowl full of jelly. And his eyes smiled as he laughed, and his nose crinkled up, and his mouth turned into a half moon. I can't remember if we saw this page, but it's pretty exciting, so I'll show it. There we go. "Why, it is a happy human," the fairy said, and they were laughing and jumping with glee, for at last they had seen a human. "Hello there, little boys and girls. I hope you are being especially good this Christmas," called the happy human. The forest fairies just looked at each other. "Should we call hello?" asked Winker. "Or should we tell him we're not little boys and girls at all, but that we are forest fairies?" asked Tinker. "Maybe we should go back to the house," said Tinker, rather tearfully. "Even if it is a happy human, I think I'm a little afraid. It is such a big human." And the little forest fairies were quiet as they looked at each other. So this was... Okay. "Don't be afraid of me," said the happy human voice. "I am everyone's friend, young and old alike. For you see, I'm Santa Claus." So this was Santa Claus that loved all the little children and the big children too. And this was the happy voice that made everyone so very happy. And it was this human who gave toys and presents to good little children and who decorated Christmas trees. Yes, they had heard about him many, many times for many, many years. Everyone knew about Santa Claus, even the forest fairies who lived in the very old tree in the very old forest. "Now I know why why Santa Claus is here," said Tinker. "He's looking for the most beautiful fir trees to be Christmas trees for good little boys and girls." Santa Claus walked toward the little three forest friends who lived underneath the big fallen tree in the forest that was known world over for its beautiful fir trees. And the fairies smiled when they saw him coming toward them. Now, we don't know exactly what the forest fairies said or what Santa Claus said, but we know that from that day on until this, Santa Claus has many, many little forest fairy friends who are helpers in all the forests. They help him find beautiful Christmas trees for the good little boys and girls all over the world. And we know that the little forest fairy friends still dress in their turned-up shoes, their tight little jackets with the shiny buttons, and their crinkledy stovepipe hats. And you wonder how we know. Well, this is a Christmas secret we learned a long, long time ago when we were very little, just like you. And there's the final picture in my story. I hope you enjoyed this reading. Thanks for coming.